Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Towering Inferno from 1974. Irwin Allen's disaster movies are probably some of the more infamous and influential disaster films to come out of cinema history, I guess. Although the airplane disaster films had already been going on for about 20 years at this point, really starting with The High and the Mighty with John Wayne, The Towering Inferno kind of sets it as, things that aren't airplanes, and decides to instead do a giant monolith of a tower that has just recently opened and a fire that happens within it. A massive towering inferno, if you will. Now, this was a hugely expensive, big blockbuster of a movie, actually bringing together Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox. Two studios working together was still rare then, but it's mostly because Warner Brothers actually outbid Fox for a film called The Tower, and then Fox for like $400,000, and then Fox spent $300,000 to buy the rights to a book called The Glass Inferno. And instead of having two competing disaster films, which happened with Deep Impact and Armageddon, and then Volcano and Dante's Peak in the 90s, which I think Dante's Volcano would have been a cooler title. But instead of doing that, they decided to join forces and make the most ultimate big tower thing on fire movie that had ever been attempted, I guess. Mostly because Irwin Allen realized, I can't make my big, tall skyscraper movie with a fire in it movie if these guys are doing it also. That'll just ruin everything. So they decided to join forces and make a massive blockbuster with a huge, ridiculous cast. And this was kind of like a massive, big, the studio system working together kind of a movie after, they had it all sort of fallen apart type of thing. It's sort of not exactly a 70s film, but it's it is a 70s film, but it's not like, they can't all be taxi drivers and Godfathers, I guess. And so you get something like The Towering Inferno, which is funny. I still think it's funny that it was based on a book called Two Books. This movie's not good enough to be based on one book, but it's based on two books, The Tower and then The Glass Inferno, and they're like, let's combine them, Towering Inferno. And that's not all. When they refer to it in the movie, they refer to it as The Glass Tower, which I like. The tower gets in there twice, but they had to switch out Glass and Inferno. It's like, all right, guys. And it was like this big blockbuster, big studio thing at the time. They had a massive cast with everyone from Faye Dunaway, Fred Astaire, Susan Blakely, Richard Chamberlain, O.J. Simpson. Yes, O.J. Simpson's in this. He saves a cat. It's real. You get the sweet, cuddly side of O.J. Simpson, which is now ironic, but at the time was just who O.J. was. Robert Vaughn, Robert Wagner, Susan Flannery, Gregory Sierra, Dabney Coleman, who's first rate, Jennifer Jones, and William Holden, who wanted to be top billed but wasn't a big enough of a star, so just third billed. And then you have the two leads who share billing, apparently, Steve Mcqueen and Paul Newman, who insisted on getting paid the exact same, which I believe was $1 million, and depending on which movie trivia thing you read, between 7.5% of the gross and 10% of the gross, each got that. Which they should, because this was an expensive movie. You should get paid for that. But the kind of stupid thing is that they insisted on having both be top billed, which was an argument they couldn't solve for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which is why Steve McQueen wasn't in that, because they couldn't decide who would be billed over the other one, and I guess they went, fuck this, whatever, and he just moved on, and Robert Redford got it. That's like a real thing that happened. And so they had it so Steve McQueen's name is here, and Paul Newman's name is here. So if you're reading left to right, you see Paul Newman first, but if you're reading up and down, you see Steve McQueen first. I think that's how it worked. Anyway, it was this huge graphic design thing. It was a big poster thing at the time, because how people are billed above a poster still to this day is a big dumb Hollywood thing, and I'm not even joking with you. It's really they really care about that still. But at the time, they probably cared about it more because people looked at those things more, and they insisted on doing that. And they also, much like Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but a lot more stupid, Steve McQueen and Paul Newman both have the same amount of lines. They literally, Steve McQueen's character didn't have a lot of lines and doesn't actually show up till 40 minutes in the movie, but they still had to make sure they had to shoot additional scenes so they had enough lines to contractually work this thing out, so they both had the same number of lines. I'd love to see the stupid arguments they had over this and how it mattered to both of them so much. Is dumb as crap, because you have all these various movie stars who various people want to see. Although I will say Paul Newman and Steve McQueen are definitely the leads of the film. You kind of have problems where you have to give everyone like their little stupid moment, and a lot of times it's like very hard to like, you know, like OJ saves the cat and then is like gone for the rest of the movie until like the very end. People like Robert Vaughn and Robert Wagner, you know, dies really early, spoilers. It's never really well utilized cast in a lot of ways. There's like certain people they found reasons to use, but I think it was just, that's a tradition that goes back to basically the first one, which was The High and the Mighty, of having this ridiculous cast in this thing. But this one was like Hollywood really going forward with it. I don't actually understand why Fred Astaire's in this, because he doesn't like dance, and it's like sort of weird. And then he got a Best Supporting Actor nomination, his only Oscar nomination, for this film, which I think is stupid, because one, he's like not even really that great in it, and two, it's like, why did you not take care of that in the 30s? Like, seriously, guys? I mean, it's kind of like one of those pity nominations where they're like, oh, this is embarrassing. Well, we'll nominate him for this embarrassing movie, and you're like, ugh, guys, really? And this was nominated for Best Picture. It lost to Godfather Part 2, which is probably the only time a disaster movie and a sequel were nominated for Best Picture in the same year. I think so, right? The weird thing about watching blockbusters, because this is like a year before Jaws, 3 years before Star Wars, before the summer blockbuster thing really took off. This was not a summer blockbuster. It came out around Christmas. And the flow of this movie is very kind of odd. It's jumping around between way too many plot lines. It has a lot of romances that don't necessarily need to be in there. I think James Cameron came up with a much better way of having a one romance. Like, you notice, like I think Independence Day handles it a little better in terms of that, and in terms of our modern version of blockbuster, you care a little bit more about character. Whether it's really that well done or not is debatable, but one thing that Spielberg and Lucas brought to it is they brought to a personal connection to it. It wasn't just like, hey, they have a romance, people fall in love, can't you relate? Fuck you. And like in Jaws, you have a personal connection to Roy Schneider and Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw. Like, you understand that you're on the adventure. It's so thrilling and propulsive in it, you just want to go along with the ride. Towering Inferno doesn't really have that, and to be honest, it's like more about the event, but the event's not even that well shot or edited or anything like that. The difference between what Spielberg would do later is he was able to bring in, like, use like the weight of film history and everything he learned to make incredibly, undeniably great, well-made sequences. And Towering Inferno, you can see what it's like seeing what a blockbuster would have been like had Spielberg not happened, and it's fucking dull as all shit. I mean, it's just like you're watching this film and like it's not even shot that well. There's like one part where Robert Wagner's character is on fire. They have a lot of people on fire, so if you're like, that's a thing for you, this is like a total good movie for you, I guess. And he, like, that part is really well shot and really kind of like hypnotic and a little beautiful, but most of it is just like there's a bunch of fire and they're putting it out, and like, let's have various other bizarre things happen so this movie can keep being longer and longer. It's almost 3 hours, which is like super unnecessary. Between all the plot lines and everything that's going on, you really get kind of like, I was into it, but it was like such a surface level movie. It's like so surface level, like at least in Independence Day I can kind of follow Will Smith's character, which also, that's another film that I think when you watch a lot of disaster movies you kind of appreciate more, because first off, nobody does a great performance and becomes a star out of disaster movies. It just doesn't happen. You might have a classic star do a better performance and like sort of like them a little more for a little bit, but nobody like what Will Smith did in Independence Day. Like, watching this movie made me appreciate that performance more, because you're like, not only were you charismatic and star making, you were just like, to pop out of a movie like that with all those various plot lines is really hard to do, and I don't think a lot of people did, except for maybe Richard Chamberlain, who I don't know that much because I'm too young to really experience the whole Thornbirds nonsense, but he is like so evil and so shitty. It's like he's such a son of a bitch, and they keep like making him kind of the heel of this whole movie, which I think sort of works for him. He's probably the only character who's not like, hey, we should do what's right, you know. William Holden a little bit is like a little schemy, I guess, but for the most part, it's like having too many do-gooders. You kind of just want someone to be evil. Also, this film has kind of like too much of a caring heart. Like, you're supposed to sort of feel bad that these disaster things are happening, but you can feel bad and have a thrilling sequence, but it almost seems to hold back on like really getting into those sequences. It might also be because Irwin Allen, who directed all the action sequences, and John Gillerman, who directed all the parts that nobody remembers, or the non-action sequences. They're like studio directors in the sense of like just boring studio directors. I mean, this is the guy who directed the 70s King Kong and things like that. So they're very much doing what a studio director was then, but kind of the old school of studio director that obviously we needed to rebel from. You know, I feel like this era of studio director, there's certain ones that are good, but there's others that like didn't survive the blockbuster kind of transition years. That's because I don't think they necessarily had the absolute love of cinema, like sitting in a cutting room and editing an insane sequence while also caring about the character. It's like they have certain sequences that like it does care about character, but it's more about like, hey, we need to fill like 20 minutes, let's have this thing. And there are too many sequences like that where it's like, we need to go back to this plot line and have, you know, Paul Newman like kind of go off of this railing. We need to have Steve McQueen do this thing. We need to have this overcomplicated way of getting this thing, and we need to show the schematics of it. It's not edited for, you know, the experience of the movie. It's edited almost for the logistics of how to do that. Like, I guess people in the 70s were like, oh, fucking logistics, I can't wait. How would they get this like stupid seat to go from like one building to the other? It's like you can do that very quickly, but it's like that wasn't really the norm at the time. I still like this movie, and I still like it in doing its outdated thing. I was actually kind of more drawn in, although I was like, this is my night, watching the Towering Inferno. And my wife was like, before I watched it, it sounds like a movie where it's really long and everyone goes, oh no, there's fire. And I can't disagree with that. I understand why people might be nostalgic for this. I would actually like to see it on the big screen. Also, Bobby Brady's in this, which I didn't realize. I don't know if I said his name, but he's in this also. That was surprising. I didn't even know that. He's not on the poster. I don't know why. That was a mistake on their part. He's like one of the kids, obviously. Like, I've seen some 70s disaster films. I'm not like an expert by any means. I've seen The Poseidon Adventure a couple times. But I think The Poseidon Adventure had some pretty cool, awe-inspiring sequences. I think The Towering Inferno, once you're in it and once you're watching it and once you've sort of agreed and settled to the terms of like, this is a little like, you know, not as exciting kind of a film, and it feels like, it's not that like I have a problem with older films. Obviously, I see silent films from the 30s, early 20s, 40s, 50s, and so forth. But this just doesn't have the kind of finesse in it. It doesn't have the kind of understanding of narrative. Like, I think particularly in a film like The High and the Mighty, they introduce everybody very kind of like simply, but they do that for a reason. So narratively, you follow everyone. And this time, it like slowly introduces people, and there's this long about drama, and like it really needs all of its length to like fill in all these gaps, but like honestly, as a viewer, it doesn't feel like they actually needed all this time to fill in these plot lines. It felt like someone long and drawn out and not adhering to a structure. The structure is like, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing. It's not like because of this, then this happened, and because of that happened. It's mainly running on the engine of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And it's actually of that kind of a thing, of this kind of not propulsive disaster movie thing, it flows actually pretty well. Like, of those films, I'd say this is probably one of the better ones, but it's like you have the 70s where you have these film kids who are coming in and loving cinema to the point of almost breaking it, and The Towering Inferno feels like somebody who's just in there to like fine-tunely like make a film that everybody's okay with, and like have all these studio egos and handle them all, and, you know, not do anything too crazy or out of the box or anything. And it felt like such an opposite of the 70s thing, and that's not why I don't like it necessarily as much as those films. I don't like it because it just doesn't have that personal connection. Irwin Allen had a hard time understanding Star Wars and Steven Spielberg, and I think the reason he does is he was like, there's no romance and just a disaster, and that's like seems to be his main complaint. And it's like, yeah, but the reason I like Indiana Jones isn't because there's a romance in it, it's because of the amazing sequences. It's because, you know, Indiana Jones felt like a character who could get punched in the face and get back up again. He didn't feel impervious the way these guys do. And I think a lot of what this film would later bring about, particularly the 90s disaster films that really influenced those, and having this ridiculous cast, what Irwin Allen did specifically, I think it owes a lot to the previous, you know, airplane disaster films. But I think as they started to take these off of airplanes and evolve them to other places, they basically like learned how to, the kind of basic makeup of these films is what led to things like Independence Day and Armageddon and Deep Impact, and like, you know, however, all the Roland Emmerich ones and all that stuff. Roland Emmerich was a little better at, in certain cases, doing character. I feel like this is too much about like going from sequence to sequence and plot line to plot line. It almost had too many and didn't feel as fun. It almost had like too many plot lines, to be honest. It gets a little like you kind of go with its hokiness, which I think is part of Irwin Allen's appeal. I don't necessarily love it. I'd probably watch this more to be like, well, this is a major 70s film I actually haven't seen, so I should like just like finally get this done with, I guess. And it's kind of interesting, everyone in the 70s was sort of down with this movie, but I think it's because it was so different from what was really going on. Like there wasn't like a ton of films like this like there are now. Now it's like a little like, ugh. And we're in a post 9/11 age, and like a tower on fire probably represents a lot of different things than it did in 1974. And a lot of these huge buildings were coming more and more up at the time, so this was kind of more topical. Although at the beginning they keep doing this like shot of everyone looking up at the tower, and it's like the same shot over and over again. And I was like, I understand like it's people looking up at the stupid thing, but like, can we just like a variety of cinematography here? This did win for cinematography and editing and best song, and it was the highest grossing film of that year. I sort of get it in a certain regard, but I kind of go with the 70s hokiness of it. It might not gel with my romanticization of the 70s that I often do with these great Scorsese, Spielberg, Coppola, Bogdanovich, countless others kind of movies. It's more of like the 70s mainstream, and I think sometimes we have to come to terms with like what we nostalgically take away from a decade isn't what the decade was. And maybe this is actually literally it's the highest grossing movie of the year, nominated for Best Picture. This is what 70s mainstream was. And in certain cases you go, oh, so mainstream sucked then as much as it does now. And this kind of feels like that kind of mainstream, like almost what a CSI would become, where it's like not about the character, it's more about the event and the plot line going on, but in such a bland, cookie cutter sort of way. And that's sort of what the Towering Inferno feels like. It's good at doing that, but I don't think like the disaster kind of genre isn't one that owes itself to a lot of like love from its creators. There's a reason why Spielberg's War of the Worlds felt so different from like any of the other disaster films, because he wants to do something through a character's lens and something like that, say something about that character. And Towering Inferno doesn't say something about Paul Newman other than he wishes they hadn't fucked up his designs. It just doesn't really get as into that. And I think like it's so removed from what Blockbuster would become, but I can appreciate it for what it is. But I guess like narratively, I think you have to look at this thing and go, well, why is this weaker than it is now, and not go, oh, it's outdated and it's old and they have like 70s shag carpeting and things like that, so it's like not as good just because of that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying like now what we did to Blockbuster and even like superhero movies, Marvel movies, DC movies, all that stuff, is we understand how to do that with character. And it's not so much we evolved because we're better, it's just because narratively we understood how to get that to connect more to an audience. And I think this connects to an audience of the event of what it was, but it doesn't connect to an audience on, you'd remember anyone's character's name other than Steve McQueen, Fred Astaire, Paul Newman, O.J. Simpson, Dabney Coleman, who has a small cameo, but I like Dabney Coleman. It's just like stuff like that is like kind of like this film is an event. It's an event, big studio, the system works, I guess, sort of, not really, kind of Blockbuster. And in this case, I sort of appreciate it for the event of what they're trying to do. Yes, this is absolutely successful, but it makes you sort of look at what kind of these big Blockbuster type of movies were right before the next, maybe 6 months later, when the Blockbuster would literally be shattered by a different movie with, by the way, John Williams did the score to this also, with a John Williams score, which is also a lot better and knew how to use the music better and everything like that. If you ever wondered like, hey, what was John Williams doing before? How come we don't talk about him as much from those scores? Because like Spielberg like elicited and more of a simplistic kind of narrative way to get that to work better, but almost use more complications within that simplicity. Towering Inferno uses too many complications to kind of have almost like a bland level of simplicity that they're not doing anything with. The Towering Inferno is worth seeing if you're into the Irwin Allen stuff. I think you might have a hard time with it if you're watching disaster films of now and you're into those. I think it's definitely something you should see. I would probably recommend The High and the Mighty More. I think that film's a lot stronger than the Towering Inferno and understands how to do that narratively, and actually is a lot better at character too. This isn't about character, it's about the event. But if you're seeing the Towering Inferno, you're probably just seeing it for the event, so you probably shouldn't be complaining about the character. But I guess as a film viewer and as someone who enjoys story, I think it's a film that there's certain films that don't need everything. They don't need every component to be a good movie. There's not like a checklist to narratively review a film, but in this case I think you can tell when a recipe's missing an ingredient, and I think the Towering Inferno kind of works without that ingredient, but I still miss it and will still enjoy eating a different meal with that ingredient in it a lot more. So if you have seen the Towering Inferno and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.